What's up, guys? Welcome to the Chess Giant. This is Solomon Riddell, and today we continue our Hippopotamus Defense series with an instructive game played by Gerard Welling back in the year of 1997. Now, here he showed some key Hippo concepts, which I think y'all will enjoy, hopefully learn a thing or two from as well, and can utilize in your own games. Now, here White started off with the move of e4, and we see Welling continue with the modern defensive g6, immediately fianchettoing that bishop on g7 and fighting for those central dark squares. And now we see this move of bishop c4 from White, followed by castling kingside. And here we see the move of e6, but I just wanted to really quickly mention, in a position like this, do not continue with knight d7. This is a very common way to play the modern defense / hippo setup. If you're playing the modern defense, you may be looking at ideas like knight f6. If you're playing the hippo, you're wanting to play e6 followed by knight e7. But y'all, this knight d7 move just lost us the game, and it's because we have a fianchettoed bishop, and White has a knight on f3, in addition to a bishop on c4. What on earth am I talking about? Well, right now, White is able to play bishop takes f7 with check. Whole idea being, if a move like king f8, we're simply down a pawn, and we have a terrible position to work with. And here, if we capture the bishop on f7, we see knight g5 with check. And notice now, because of our knight on d7, this bishop no longer protects the square of e6. So if we play a move like king f8, we have knight e6 with check, winning the queen on d8. If king e8 is playing knight e6, and our queen can't even move. And if we try to save the queen by playing king f6, protecting this square, which again, this knight on d7 is preventing our light squared bishop from doing, we now see this idea of queen f3 with check. I mean, really, if White plays this right, we're going to be losing in just a couple moves no matter what we do. Even if we just take this knight on g5, White plays d4 with check, and sure, we are up 5 points in material, but we have a king on h4, and we see this move of queen h3 with checkmate, and it's time to go home. So again, y'all, White has this idea of bishop takes f7 with check, followed by knight g5 and eyeing knight e6 ideas, but that's only going to work if our bishop is not currently defending this square on e6. So don't play a move like knight d7. Here we see the move instead of e6, which is a great alternative, really trying to limit the activity of that bishop on c4. And now we see White continue with d4, followed by knight e7 from Welling, and now this move of a6. Now, usually in the Hippopotamus defense, we put our pawns on a6, b6, g6, and h6, but in a position like this, why not start off with the move a6 and potentially get a b5 push, right? Attacking this bishop with tempo, continuing then with bishop b7, having b4 ideas, attacking the knight. This b5 move would definitely be advantageous for us, gaining some activity and space on the queen side. So here we see this move from White of a4. Going, look, I mean, if we play a move like b5, I'm simply just going to capture that pawn. So we now see this move of b6, and now following bishop e3, knight d7, h6, and bishop b7. We have officially reached the hippopotamus setup, using our e and d pawns, only pushing them up one square and tucking these knights closely behind, not to mention these bishops on g7 as well as b7 and the normal pawn structure we see on the edges of the board. Here White continues with this move of rook a e1, and there's a ton of different ideas that we've covered on this channel concerning the Hippopotamus defense, but one of them is using one of our knights on e7 or d7 and really trying to put some pressure on one of White's central pawns. And one of my general rules of thumb is going, look, which one of these current pawns is most defended? The answer is this pawn on d4, right? This pawn on d4 is protected by 1, 2, 3 different pieces, whereas this pawn on e4 is only protected by the knight on c3. So in this case, let's go after the pawn that is least protected with knight f6. Right now, actually just threatening to capture it right off the board. If White wants to play something like e5, we have knight fd5 and knight e4 ideas in the air, both of which are very active. And here, if we see the move of d5, which is what was played in the game, we can lock the center up with e5. Now, many of you are probably wondering why on earth we're wanting to lock the center up in a position like this. It's not always like this in the Hippo, but oftentimes we do like the idea of locking up the center. And that's because at this point, we are the ones in the driver's seat with all the flexibility and all of the options. Look at this position from the White perspective. I mean, what on earth can White even do? White could play a move like a5, but in that case, okay, we're going to play b5 and attack your bishop on c4. White can't really break through in the center at all, and White spent all this time trying to centralize their pieces, even get a rook involved on e1, but this game is simply deadlocked. Now, from the Black perspective, we do have more options, one of them being this key idea of g5 followed by knight g6, another idea being a potential f5 push, and in some lines and variations, we can always play something like c6. Now, in this position, I don't think that c6 is very applicable, but we do have a lot of different ideas that we can go with. The one thing that white can try to do here is break this game open with f4, and that's exactly what we see here with knight h2. But here Welling goes, look, white really needs to try to get this move in to break this game open. Really, that's the only thing they have at the moment. Why not play this move of g5, continue with my normal plan of a potential knight g6, and on top of that, simply prevent this move f4 from happening in the first place. Now white yet again is answering the question of how on earth do I try to get a one game here? Again, if a move like a5, we simply continue with b5. If b4 from white and b5, okay, we'll lock it up with a5. And now as black, we are starting to gain some potential momentum on the king side of the board, while white's having a hard time figuring out what to do. White here realizes that we do have some potential weakness in our light squares, so we see this idea of bishop e2 eyeing this g4 square. And now as black, I think one thing that we got to realize is that when we do lock up the center, some of our pieces are going to become less active. One of them is this bishop on b7, right? I mean, this bishop on b7 isn't serving any good purpose at all. It's attacking the pawn on d5, but it's defended by a queen and knight, and most importantly, this pawn on e4. So why not try to activate it? In the hippo, depending on what position you're in, you can always play a move like bishop a6, or in this situation, the very simple move of bishop c8. Why not just bring this bishop back one square, and all of a sudden, you have one more very active and attacking piece. Here, white continues with this move of knight g4, and Welling responds with this idea of knight g6. But I really want to quickly mention, okay, what happens if black takes on g4? Why didn't Welling, an international master level player, just take on g4 and force white into doubled pawns? Well, in this situation, white would probably take back with the bishop, in which case, okay, we could capture back again. And it seems as if white's pawn structure on the king side is more than weak. But this is not so simple in terms of how to take advantage of this. I mean, right now, if we play a move like h5, white can simply just capture our pawn right off the board and then slide their queen one square over, attacking our rook. And the moment that our rook moves away, we just lost our pawn on g5. This bishop is pinning the knight on e7 to the queen. White here has potential f4 break ideas, and this is just not the situation we want to have with the black camp. Now, really quickly, I want to go back to this position, in which case we played knight takes g4 in addition to bishop takes g4. Many of you are probably wondering, okay, if we play a move like h5 right away, we're going to lose our pawn. Why not try to lock things up first and then play this move of h5 once g5 is protected? But now white has the time to play queen e2, really protecting the pawn on g4, and most importantly, this square of h5. I mean, if we play h5, white's simply going to capture back, and it's going to be protected by the queen. And in this line, I still don't think that it's an easy one for white. White definitely has a battle ahead of them on how to win this game, but I do think that white here is able to make somewhat progress with moves like f3, g3, maybe bring this king to f2, bring a rook to h1, and start putting pressure on our king side. While as we as black, I'm not really seeing hardly any breakthroughs that we can try to get at all. I mean, we can always try to play something like knight g6, but again, white can play g3, preventing our knight from coming into h4 or f4. And on top of that, look at our bishop on g7. We have 7 pawns on dark squares. This isn't checkers, but it might as well be. This bishop on g7 can barely move, and I don't know how on earth this bishop is not going to be a tall pawn at any point in this game if white plays this correctly. So again, y'all, white is trying their best to create something in this position, bringing the bishop to e2, launching this knight into g4. Here, Welling goes, look, I mean, I could take on g4, but trying to take advantage of those double pawns is a lot harder than it may first seem. So I'm just going to continue with this move of knight g6 and eye this very key square of f4, and also this potential square of h4 for my knight, and really just try to keep the tension, right? I mean, if white does want to play a move like knight takes f6, we'll simply capture back. We don't see this, but instead this idea of g5. White here is really making it clear they're trying to get this f4 push in, and let's face it, I mean, white's rooks are locked and loaded on the f and e1 files. A lot of white's pieces are centralized and developed. If white can play this move of f4 and break this game open, we're going to be in some trouble. So Welling realized all this. He realized that white's really trying to play this move of f4, and that g3 supports this pawn push. But guys, remember, in chess, every single time you play a move, you are gaining something, but you're also giving something away. White did improve their position in the sense that this pawn on g3 did something that the pawn on g2 didn't. This pawn defends and really attacks the square of f4, trying to prepare that push. But the thing that this pawn on g3 doesn't do is protect the pawn on h3. So we see this move of h5, Welling realizing that sure, white is trying to break this game open, but at the same time, they're weakening the pawn structure in front of their king. We see h5. Here, white decides to play knight takes f6 with check. Notice how we don't see queen takes f6 because after bishop takes g5, we just lost our queen. So instead, we see this move of bishop takes back, and now the stated threat, bishop takes h3, which would simply give us a 1 game. So here, white defends that with king g2. And now we see this idea from black, knight f4 with check. We don't want to see the move f4, so why not just throw this knight in ourselves and attack the king on g2. In the game, we see white continue with bishop takes f4. Many of you may be wondering, okay, wait, why didn't white want to take on f4 with the pawn instead of their bishop? Well, notice now the bishop's going to be lost anyways. There's literally nowhere for this bishop to go. The best thing that white can do is simply capture on f4 with this bishop. But notice now how open this king on g2 is. I mean, here if white continues with something like queen takes pawn going up in material, we now play this move of bishop e5 and following queen e3. Why not just bring our rook to the open file, continue by throwing our queen into the action? And I mean, talk about an active game for black here. White is on the verge of losing this game in only a few moves. So here with this knight f4 check idea, white goes, look, I mean, I could take this knight on f4 with the pawn and then have to take with the bishop, making the game even more open, or I could just capture with the bishop and then try to keep things closed with a move like rook h1, trying to support this pawn on h3. Now from black, by taking with the e-pawn, this may seem a little bit counterintuitive because we're trying to break open the files. It may seem as if we should have taken with the g-pawn so that our rook can come to g8. But now we see this key idea of bishop e5. By playing e takes f4, we just opened up this key square. And notice that this bishop really isn't going anywhere anytime soon. I mean, we could give this bishop on e2 a million moves, and it's never going to be able to quite reach this square of e5. And on top of that, this knight on c3 is 4 moves away from our bishop. If you guys weren't aware before, any square that is 2 squares diagonal from one of your knights is going to result in the knight playing 4 moves to get there. So this knight on c3, it's going to take 4 moves to get to e5, 4 moves to get to a5, 4 moves to get to a1. You get the point. Just a little tip there in case you're in time trouble or trying to figure out how long it's going to take you to maneuver your knight to hit a certain spot. So again, this bishop on e2 can never touch e5. This knight is 4 moves away because it is 2 moves diagonal of the bishop. So really this bishop on e5 is extremely comfortable, and right now we're continuing to put pressure on the king side of the board. Here white continues with this idea of g4, really trying to lock things up. But here black's going, look, from a practical standpoint, I'm not trying to play a move like h4 and lock the king side up. I'm the one on the attack. Why not capture off this pawn and then here continue with a move like queen f6. Here white decides to capture on h8 with check, followed by rook h1, attacking our major queen. And after this move of queen f6, a big question arises, and that's, again, how on earth does white try to break through here? I mean, these pawns on e4 and d5 aren't going anywhere. Again, this knight ain't going to touch the bishop for a long time. This bishop can never touch the bishop on e5. We currently have a lot of pressure coming on g4. And really, I mean, trying to push on the queen side, as always, simply is not going to work because we can lock things up. So here we actually just see white go back and forth with their rook on h1. They saw no way to improve the positioning of their pieces. So here we see this idea of rook h3, back to h1, back to h3, on and on. Notice that black, on the other hand, with the hippo, had a lot of options and a lot of flexibility on both sides of the board, and a lot of flexibility, and with it, slowly improve the positioning of his pieces. Bishop d7, king e7, and finally rook h8, fighting for that h-file. Here we see this idea of queen d3, in which case black goes, okay, I'll just take your rook off, and now continue with bishop takes c3. And the reason for this is we really want to just take this pawn on a4, but it currently has a defender, so why not remove the defender and then simply go up a pawn, attacking this pawn on c2 as well. Here white defends that with queen d3, and we now see this idea of bishop d7. Here white could have taken this pawn on a6, but in that case we're simply going to play queen takes c3, attacking the pawn on c2 as well. And here as black, we do have a lot of different ways that we can try to improve our position. One key idea is playing something here such as queen h8 and potentially queen h4. We have queen e5 ideas, putting some pressure on e4. White here tries to play the move of queen c4, but in this case there's no reason to play hero chess, try to play something like queen e5, attacking the pawn on e4. Just close this game down. Right? I mean, just try to limit the activity of your opponent's pieces. Play king d8. Again, white can take on a6 whenever they want. They're simply going to lose the pawn on c3. But here we instead see this idea of f3. Again, it's just hard for white to figure out what on earth to do in a position like that. They're just kind of waiting around for us as black to try to make improvements. But guys, this move of f3, even though it does protect a couple of pawns, was simply a blunder because we now see this idea of bishop b5 attacking the queen, and here white resigned the game. Because notice, I mean, if this queen runs away to a square like a2, we're simply going to snatch off the bishop, and white can't even take the pawn on a6 because we simply win the queen. I mean, even if a move like queen takes a6 was played and our bishop wasn't here, there's really not a way that white's going to get perpetual checks in a position like that. But again, there's just no hope for white to make any kind of breakthrough here. I mean, even if this queen got a few moves in a row and tried to, try to get over to the h file, try to make some damage over here, I mean, again, this queen on f6 is really protecting some of those key squares. There's just no way for white to try to hang on here. So a couple moves back, we see a draw, and we see a very nice finish and just overall game by our guy, Gerard Welling. Thanks for watching today's video. If you'd like to learn more on the theory behind the Hippopotamus Defense, click that video to the left. If you'd like to see our entire Hippopotamus Defense playlist, click that playlist to the right. Leave a comment down below to let me know what other videos you'd like to see covered on this channel. And as always, I appreciate you guys. Thanks for watching. Peace.